Welcome to the class, my dear students. Today is the second last session that we're having together. What I hope to do today is to introduce a topic which is potentially present in the design and structure of the course program, but has not been explicitly stated. And the reason why we are making actual what was only a potential in the course design was that we have a new situation which was not there before when the course was designed, and that is the widespread pandemic that you observe. But when you start thinking about the pandemic and its economic implications for both economics as a subject, the discipline of economics, and for economic policy, you begin to think more deeply about the nature of crises in general that have afflicted the market-based system that we call capitalism. And so what I thought I would do in today's lecture is to essentially, since you're mashallah budding economists, essentially look at the pandemic to draw the lessons for economic theory and economic policy. But in so doing, we also then quickly examine two other major crises which confront humankind today, and that is the crisis of the global environment, the climate change crisis, which constitutes a threat to the life support systems of the planet, and then the crisis of growing inequalities within the market framework. So therefore, we'll look at not just one crisis, the crisis of the pandemic, but also the two other crises that are before us, and to then analyze what are the implications for economic theory and economic policy, if you like, of these three crises. If you think about the implications for economic theory, they're rather profound. And I dare say that if economists across the world begin to think in some depth about the implications for economic theory, then I dare say that a fundamental change in the whole paradigm of economics and the whole way in which economics is taught will have to begin to change. Indeed, it is already changing in some of the leading universities of the world. And by discussing these things with you, budding economists, I hope that this will, in some humble fashion, contribute to your thinking at the cutting edge of the subject itself. And so that at some point in your studies, you will be able to contribute to the subject of economics itself at the cutting edge, especially when you go on to do graduate studies. Okay, so here goes. There are three major implications of the pandemic as far as economics is concerned. The first, of course, is that, and these three things are apparent to the ordinary individual who has done no economics. The first thing that is apparent is that this market system seems to have ended up to produce the wrong kinds of goods and services, not the kinds of goods and services which the large mass of the people need. So you have, during this pandemic, the poignant situation where on the one hand there is a severe shortage of basic items like personal protective equipment of doctors masks and gowns and so on, and hospital beds, doctors and nurses, while on the other hand, you have a surplus of consumer luxury durables. You have showrooms of luxury motor cars full, which are not being used. They're just lying there because of the lockdown. Nobody can go there, or until recently couldn't go there to buy the cars. You have luxury 5-star, 7-star hotels, which are lying largely vacant because people can't, the rich can't, they're locked up at home. And so you have, on the one hand, the vast array of luxury consumer goods for the rich, and on the other hand, for the ordinary people, for overwhelming proportion of the people, there is a severe shortage of basic items which they need to protect life. Similarly, you have more than enough weapons of mass destruction to destroy life on the planet, or at least human life on the planet. But on the other hand, you don't have basic items to protect and preserve life. So you have enough to destroy life, but not enough to protect life. And so these obvious contradictions in terms of the basket of goods which the capitalist system has produced in the market-based societies has become apparent. At the same time, the second aspect related, which has emerged, is that governments across the capitalist world have been seen to have underfunded the health infrastructure, health facilities. And that is based on the economic theory which has been in fashion, which has been the dominant economic theory, at least in the post Second World War period. Well, not the immediate post Second World War period, but let's say from the 70s onwards, which is almost the last half century or so. The dominant economic theory has been that the market system is the most efficient framework for the allocation of resources, for the production of goods, and for the distribution of goods. So in other words, the basic idea there is that the three key questions that are supposed to be answered by economic theory is that in terms of a society, um, how much should be produced of what goods and for whom? How much should be produced of what and for whom? These three questions, it is supposed in this mainstream economics that these three questions will be answered by the free market mechanism. Now, within that framework, of course, there is virtually no role for the government. The idea has been, ever since Maggie Thatcher and President Reagan's took up this ideology of the free market delivering to the people, that ideology, once that it was taken up, led to the view that the less government there is, the better. And so there wasn't much of a role of the government as far as the economy was concerned. And it was in terms of that particular way of thinking, that particular paradigm of thinking, that the governments in the capitalist countries let the market determine how many hospitals and how many doctors were to be produced, by and large, and it was thought that the private sector will cater to the needs of demand of health for people, and people should be paying for health facilities by and large. Of course, Britain to some extent was an exception because it had a tradition of a welfare state since since the end of the Second World War. The idea of that, it is the duty of the state to provide health facilities and education and so on. And so the National Health Service had been set up. But following the Maggie Thatcher return to the market-based ideology, the National Health Service began to be heavily underfunded, as indeed many universities, which were dependent on government support, began to be underfunded. The education sector in general suffered a decline following Maggie Thatcher's idea that the government shouldn't be interfering in the market system. So, in any case, even in Britain, although there was the National Health Service, and that was an impressive achievement of a welfare state earlier on, even there the health service was severely underfunded, as we have seen. So, therefore, to quickly recap, two lessons have emerged from the pandemic. The first is that the market mechanism as a framework for the allocation of resources of society for the production of goods and their distribution is not necessarily the most efficient framework, as was taught and has been taught to successive generations of poor students in the in the last 50 or 60 years. And the second is that the idea that the government has a minimalist role to play doesn't seem to be a very sensible idea. And the governments, as we have seen, now have a much more important role to play. In country after country in the capitalist world, whether it's Britain or Italy or Spain or the United States, you have noticed how the governments came into the economy in a big way. They had these huge uh, um, welfare packages to support people who were unemployed, and in the United States to finance the health expenditures of poor people, and to make massive expenditures in the provision of masks and ventilators and these personal protective equipment and hospital equipment. New hospitals were built very, very quickly in a number of these countries. In the United States, even a naval ship, a naval hospital ship, was brought into port and made available. So the governments enter in, despite the fact that they had earlier believed that there's very little role for the government in the economy. Governments came in a big way when they realized that it was a question of saving lives here and protecting the health of people. So therefore, we have these two lessons that the market system can no more be seen as an exclusive framework for the allocation of resources for the production of goods, in terms of letting the market decide what is to be produced, how much, and for whom. The market cannot be seen anymore, whatever the textbooks might be saying. The market system cannot be seen anymore as an exclusive, as a sole framework for this kind of decision making at the national level, and that therefore the government has a major role to play in ensuring public welfare. You see, when you go through the mainstream economic theory, even in terms of the textbook, if you come across a good textbook, something like Samuelson and Nordhaus's, Introduction to Economics, or there's a whole range of textbooks, available. If you read those, you will discover that the idea there is that the market is the most efficient framework for the allocation of resources, production, and distribution, and therefore the market system in itself ensures the maximum good of the maximum number. So it's the market system that ensures the provision of public welfare. Now that proposition obviously will have to be questioned. by students, by teachers, by universities across the world. It is already being questioned and has been questioned in some of the better universities. And what is the third lesson? These two lessons we've identified. Market cannot be seen as an exclusive framework, and the government has a much more important role to play to ensure the provision of public welfare. The third, of course, there's something very interesting, is that you will have noticed that in a sense, it's been an inspiring experience, looking at the way people have responded to the pandemic. You find in country after country that when large numbers of people uh, became unemployed as a result of the lockdown, which almost every country other than Sweden undertook, and when you found that during the lockdown, there were a large number of older people who were unable to go out and buy their groceries, etc. You then discovered that hundreds of thousands of people, young people, volunteered to go to get a list of the groceries that these old people wanted from their homes, and then they went and bought those groceries and placed those groceries with the gloves on. They placed those groceries outside the doorstep of people whom they didn't even know. Similarly, a large number of charities and non-governmental organizations came into action in Pakistan and India, and a large number, and Britain, in Pakistan, there's this Prime Minister Imran Khan set up this Tiger Force. But other than the Tiger Force, also a large number of charities and NGOs came into action, like Behbood and a number of others. They came in. Risk is another NGO in Pakistan which began to provide food to the hungry during the pandemic. So the civil society, where ordinary individuals got together, came to help, where there were NGOs and where there were charities, all these came into action to alleviate the terrible suffering that millions of people were undergoing following the lockdown and the pandemic. So here we find that a new phenomenon has emerged, which economic theory needs to take into consideration when teaching students and when formulating theory, and that is that in the old days, over the last almost 250 years, mainstream economics, which is neoclassical economics, has considered the individual as a unit of analysis in economics. And the idea is that the individual, the isolated individual, the assumption there is the idea of, in fact, this is the idea of economic rationality, that the individual makes choices in isolation from all other individuals. He or she is solely concerned with maximizing their individual material welfare to the exclusion of everybody else. So such an isolated individual, who's entirely driven by personal self-interest in maximizing their own material welfare. And then the idea is that when every individual does this, it results in a process through the market system, in the generation of a demand curve and the generation of a supply curve, and the determination of, therefore, on the basis of demand and supply, a set of prices. And these prices then become a framework for the allocation of resources and the production of goods and the distribution. So, the price system is like a kind of a night sky, the stars that guide the Bedouin on his way on a desert landscape. So the price system acts as a guide. Once prices are fixed, no individual producer, no individual consumer can influence these prices. And so the individual producers then allocate their resources according to the price system. driven solely by the desire to maximize profits. And the individual consumer who's got a limited income looks at these prices, looks at these stars in the sky, and decides his way across the desert, which is how to allocate his or her income so as to maximize his or her satisfaction, material welfare. So there was this kind of conception that was taught to students, and that was the basis in many ways of government policy all these years, barring a short period when Keynes came along and upset the apple cart and different sort of policies emerged. But other than that, by and large, mainstream economics has believed that it has conceived of society in atomized terms, that it consists of a set of individuals who are not related with each other, and that the only relationship that exists in this society is between the individual and the price system, between the individual and the market system. Now, that obviously, that kind of way of looking at things, of course, we never believed it, and we wrote a lot. And when I was at Cambridge, economics was taught very critically about this, and we studied a lot, and we wrote a lot of, in terms of an alternative way of looking at society. But by and large, universities, that's the way universities functioned in the Western world, and much more so here in Pakistan. So the idea was that society is a set of atomized individuals who make decisions in isolation. They have no consideration for any other individual. They try to maximize their material welfare, and as individuals maximize their individual welfare, they they contribute to the functioning of the market in such a way that it brings about the maximum good of the maximum number. This was, in fact, at the philosophical level, the formulation that was being propounded by the so-called utilitarian philosophers in the 19th century, such as Bentham and Mill. And these things were taught, written up in textbooks. And now that obviously has undergone a change at the popular level. I mean, we were talking about it. I was teaching this, but at the popular level, people have discovered, society is not just individuals unrelated to each other, aggregated and linked up with the market. The society is actually consists of a set of individuals have relationships with each other. So we are human beings. Individuals are actually human beings, and one of the essential features of being human is a sense of relatedness with other human beings. So we're related with each other at a human level, and that is why the whole idea of compassion and care and social responsibility comes out in society, and this is one of those occasions when it has, and that is why you find that. Communities, civil society has come forward outside the market system, outside the operations of the government, to come in and independently help, as help the community, help other members of the human community. And so the third conclusion that economics must then confront, that arises from this pandemic, is that the individual can no more be seen as a sole unit of analysis. Of course, you can use that as one of the things you do in doing economic analysis, related with the individual, but uh, the community must also enter our analysis. The community must also become a unit of analysis. So you find, for example, in the United States, I only heard this yesterday on the news, CNN, that they're sick and tired of the police, violating human rights, and sort of being very rough with individuals, and they killed Mr. George Floyd, while he was in custody. You murdered them, one of the policemen. The point is that the people, as well as now, not just ordinary people in civil society, but people within government and within the political system, have realized that the police needs to be reformed. And one of the aspects of these reforms has to be that the police has to be linked up with local communities. It has to be answerable to local communities. It has to be sensitive to the feelings and the rights of communities. And indeed, in the allocation of resources, you remember that there's this new slogan called defund the police, stop funding the police. The idea there is not to disband the police. The idea there is that when you're allocating, when government is allocating resources to at the local level to the police, some of those resources must also be allocated to local communities, so that communities can come into their own. They can become better organized, better funded, and they can interface with the police so as to induce a more humane and a more a responsible behavior towards citizens of the police. The point, therefore, that I'm making is that this is an example of how the community has become a unit of analysis in government thinking, even now in the United States, per force, where the idea is that you allocate resources to communities, not just the police. And so I'll conclude this part of the discussion by suggesting that there are three principal lessons to be drawn from the ongoing pandemic as far as economic theory and therefore economic policy is concerned. And that is, firstly, that the market mechanism can no more be seen as the exclusive actor determining the allocation of resources and therefore determining the provision of public welfare. The second implication is the government has a much more important role to play than before in these decisions with respect to what is to be produced, how much is to be produced, and for whom it is to be produced. Because the market in itself cannot achieve public welfare, maximize public welfare. The government has to play a role in the provision of public welfare. That's the second lesson. And the third lesson is that the communities also are a major player or a significant player in such decision making with respect to the provision of public welfare. So while the individual still remains important as a unit of analysis in terms of economic theory and in terms of public policy, the community is a third actor that has come into play as a unit of analysis in economic theory as much as in terms of public policy. Three actors: the market, which is of course there, the government, and communities. Okay, so this part of the discussion uh, we've had. Now, there are a number of economists, hardcore neoclassical economists, who say, yeah, well, I mean, in this case, for the pandemic, we recognize the market has failed. This is a case of market failure, and therefore the government should have come in. And the market fails, the government comes in. But these are things that happen on only very rarely. They're marginal to the system. By and large, the market system functions very well in terms of um, its role as a framework for resource allocation, production, and distribution. And the market is therefore functions efficiently, by and large, under normal circumstances, for the provision of public welfare. But my response to that is that perhaps we can think in terms of an alternative proposition. And that is that what the mainstream economists call market failure is not something that is marginal to the functioning of economics over time. What they call market failure is maybe endemic to the system itself. It may be an integral part of the way the market functions. In other words, this failure to achieve public welfare, this failure to work as a sole and efficient framework of resource allocation, may be fundamentally inadequate in the normal functioning of the market. So this inability may be part of the very physiology of the system. It's not something that is marginal to the system. Okay, in order to be able to elaborate that proposition, that the market system is endemically incapable on its own to provide public to ensure public welfare, maximization of public welfare, we need to look at the two other crises that afflict us, the world today. One is, of course, the global environmental crisis. Now, I've given a number of lectures on this, I think. And the thing about the global environmental crisis, we just look at the climate change aspect of that. The thing is that the global environmental crisis, what it has done is that it has undermined the life support systems of the planet, or it has threatened the life support systems of the planet. And what are those life support systems? They're the provision, they're the existence of fresh air to breathe, uh, the hydrologic systems which provide fresh water both for drinking as well as for irrigation, and thirdly, fertile soils, which we use to produce food. Okay, now all three elements are actually linked up within a very delicately balanced ecosystem. And scientists are now agreed that this ecosystem is under threat because of the way the human community, at least in the most of the capitalist world, has intervened into the ecosystem in terms of the volume and range of goods that has been produced, the technologies, the fossil fuel-based technologies that have been used to produce it, and the forms of consumption and waste disposal. So it is human intervention into the ecosystem that has undermined the life support system of the planet, that has begun to threaten not just human life, but all life on the planet. And so when this Paris summit was held in 2015, the leaders of the world, statesmen of the world, got together and listened to some of the leading natural scientists. And these natural scientists brought home not only the fact that the life support systems of the planet were under threat as a result of the way we were using the environment, or as a result of our forms of life and forms of production and consumption, but in fact that this threat was a very urgent threat, and they argued that if at present trends, if at present trends, if global temperatures continue to rise, and by the end of the century they increase by more than 2.5 degrees centigrade, then we will enter uncharted terrain. Then we don't have the models to predict what will happen. The scientists warned that there could be a catastrophic destabilization of the whole ecosystem of the planet, and all life could be threatened as a result. So this sense of urgency was brought into that particular summit in 2015, and the leaders agreed to do something about it. And what they did was that they agreed to limit greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing this global warming. They agreed to li- uh, limit the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade increase. So that it should not increase beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. They didn't want to use 2.5 degrees as a ceiling, because that was too close to catastrophe. So they used 1.5 degrees centigrade to be on the safe side, and then work backwards. And so it was recognized that in order to be able to achieve that target, that is to say, to limit the increase in average global temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, then global greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced to zero by 2050. Now, following that summit, where decisions were taken essentially to protect life on the planet, not just human life. And we find that rather than reducing greenhouse gas emissions since then, they had to be reduced by something like 3% annually to meet the target of zero emissions by 2050. We moved in the opposite direction, as I've shown in my earlier lectures. In fact, over the last 15 years or so, um, there's been a 5.3% annual increase in greenhouse gas carbon emissions in the planet. Instead of a decline of 3% annually, there's been an increase in annually of 5.3%. So we moved in the opposite direction. And now one of the major reasons why this has happened is the lack of a political will to implement the decisions taken in Paris. And the lack of that political will is rooted in the structure of an economy which survives, where the idea of development is that you continue to produce more and more goods and wider range of goods at the cheapest possible in the cheapest possible way, which at the moment happens to be fossil fuels. So therefore, we discover that in spite of the best intentions of governments in the capitalist world, um, we have failed to move in the direction where we could play a role in enabling life to survive on this planet. In fact, the way we are going right now, we are hurtling towards the destruction of all life by the end of this century, God forbid. And the reason for that, as I said, is that we are by and large functioning within a framework of a market where the individual production unit is solely driven by the need to make profit and the need to produce a wider and wider range of goods, and rather volume of goods in the cheapest possible way. And this market system over time has created a culture of consumerism where the individual feels fulfilled uh, exclusively on the basis of consuming more and more and a broader and broader variety of goods. We have a system now where uh, consumer goods are not simply seen in terms of their objective function. A motor car is not simply seen as a mechanical device for taking you from A to B. A motor car is seen as a receptacle of qualities which actually we once possessed, qualities of power, of efficacy, of sexuality, of beauty. And these qualities through this market system, the advertisement system, have been transposed into commodities. And we are invited to look at commodities, not simply in terms of their objective qualities, but in terms of the embodiment of these qualities of sexuality, of power, of efficacy, of success. And therefore, in a sense, when we buy commodities, we possess them essentially to repossess ourselves rather than just possess um, something that is useful. What Aristotle called merely useful. Commodities are not merely useful anymore. Commodities are the embodiment of all these supernatural qualities. And so, in that kind of system, it's not surprising that the Paris Summit goals are nowhere near being achieved. Now, this is also a failure of the market. See, and that failure is endemic to the market system. That's the way the market system is designed. That the individual production unit, in order to survive in a competitive environment, has to produce more and more goods and a wider and wider range of goods. And then it has to sell those goods. And in order to sell those goods, it has to convince consumers that they need them. So this market system is not just a system that caters to human needs, as the textbooks tell us. The market system also produces the needs which these goods satisfy. So in that sense, you can argue that the global environmental crisis phenomenon is endemic to the market system itself. It's going to be very, very difficult. It's going to require a new kind of consciousness to move away from this syndrome of considering commodities to be the be all and the end all here in this world. Okay, What about the third crisis? The third crisis is the crisis of inequalities. As the old economic theory depended on Professor Simon Kuznets' Nobel Prize winning work, where he had argued that the market system on its own will reduce inequalities over time. Now, contrary to that, Piketty has provided empirical evidence for large number of countries over a 150-year period to show that Simon Kuznets theory, which formed the basis of policy in many countries, is just a fairy story, and that actual data shows that inequalities have continuously been increasing over time. And you now have a situation where 1% of the world's population has as much wealth as the rest of the 99% put together. There's acute inequality, both in terms of income as well as in terms of wealth. And you have a situation in which a small number of people are living fabulous lives of luxury, while hundreds of millions of people are living in a situation of food insecurity, their hunger. They're living in hunger. And a large number of, something like 35 million children annually are dying due to starvation. So while on the one hand you have a few, whizzing around in private luxury aircraft, so millions, there is a massacre of the innocents taking place. So many children dying of not having enough nutrition. And so, given these inequalities, now the question is that this is not just a marginal phenomenon. This process of growing inequalities has been, the data is about 150 years old, right? But this kind of inequalities are built into the very structure of the capitalist system, and it's been there since the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century in Britain and later in Europe. And the sense in which inequality is rooted in the system itself arises essentially out of the relationship between the capitalist and the laborer. Now, the way the capitalist is able to generate appropriate what we call surplus value, or let's roughly speaking call it profit, is that the laborer is obliged, because he doesn't own the means of production, in order to survive, the laborer has to sell the one capability, the one commodity he has left, and that is the capacity to undertake labor for a given period of time during the day. That ability to work for a period of time during the day has itself become a commodity under capitalism. It is bought and it is sold. The laborer sells that capacity and gets paid for it in the form of a wage. So labor power becomes a commodity that's bought and sold. And the point is that the capitalist pays the price of labor power to the laborer in the form of a wage, and appropriates in the act of buying that labor power, he also appropriates surplus value, because the peculiar feature of labor power as a commodity, the unique feature of labor power as a commodity, is that it produces more value than its own. In other words, a laborer might be paid, let's say, 500 rupees a day, or let's say 1,000 rupees a day, working in a factory producing shoes, and he ends up by producing, let's say, 10 shoes worth 20,000 rupees in that one day. And that difference between the value of the shoes the worker produces, which is 20,000, and the value that he receives himself in terms of 1,000 rupees as a wage, that difference, that 19,000 rupees, that surplus, is called surplus value, and that is automatically appropriated by the capitalist in the act of exchange between the sale of labor power and the purchase of labor power. Okay, so this relationship is inherently unequal. Because the inequality lies in the unequal power between the capitalist and the laborer. because a laborer it does not have the power to push the capitalist to increase his wage to 20,000 rupees a month in the case that I just quoted. Right? If he produces value worth 20,000 rupees a day, he's not in a position to force the capitalist to pay him 20,000 rupees or even 19,000 rupees, right? Because of the fact that he doesn't own the means of production and he doesn't have that political organization and that clout with which to increase his wage to a point where the capitalist profit would become zero. In any case, if the capitalist profit became zero, the capitalist will stop working, right? Stop investing. And therefore, in this system, it is underlying the inequality that Piketty observed is a fundamental structural feature of the system itself, which is the inequality of power inherent in the capital labor relationship. And that is the third endemic aspect of capitalism, its tendency towards inequality. And that is by no means marginal, it is essential. It is one of the defining features of the system. It is part of the design features of the system itself. And therefore, we conclude um, by summarizing and saying that the three crises that we have very quickly referred to, the crisis of the global health crisis, secondly, the crisis of the life support system of the planet, the environmental crisis, and the third is the crisis of growing inequalities. Each of these crises is rooted in a uh, in a system that we call the market-based system or the capitalist system. It is rooted in a system where the process of the allocation of resources and production and distribution of goods is being conducted through the framework of the market, by and large exclusively. And at the heart of it, of that system, at the basis of that system, is a particular relationship between these two classes of people which have emerged uh, since the late 17th century and early 18th century, the class of laborers who don't have the means of production and the class of capitalists who do own the means of production. And it is the system of production organization determined by these two, by the relationship between capitalists and laborers, which is ended up in generating all of these three crises. And therefore, I think the lessons that have to be learned is that, I'm not suggesting that there is no solution other than revolution, where we change the system itself. I'm not necessarily saying that, although that may at some point be recognized by people, and we might go towards an alternative system, which is socialism. But or what Prime Minister Imran Khan calls the Islamic welfare state. But point is that short of that, you can still have a kind of a more muted form of capitalism in the form of a welfare state, where the government has a much more important role to play, not let the market alone function, and where communities begin to enter into the calculus of resource allocation, production, and distribution. So you end up with design an institutional reform where you have three actors coming into play for the provision of public welfare. You have the market, of course, then you have the government, and then you have uh, communities. So I'll end there and invite questions as always. Thank you. Any question, I'd be happy to answer. Okay, for those of you who left early and or who couldn't attend the class, and even those who at the moment are a little shy in asking questions, I've already circulated a paper. I've written a longish paper on this particular topic that I taught you today, the three crises. It's titled Capitalism, Crises, and Human Life, uh, which has already been published. And uh, my research assistant, Daim, has sent you the link to that paper. So what I would suggest, if you haven't read it yet, to do go ahead and read it if you're so inclined. And then maybe next time when we meet, which is the last class in this lecture course, when we meet next time, inshallah, on Wednesday, you can ask questions. So I'll devote the whole class to just question and answer session. You can ask me any question you like within the framework of the lecture course, within this particular course design. Any question you like, and if I can, I'll be happy to answer it. And if I can't answer it, I'll promise to think about it and get back to you. Um, but you're very welcome to read that paper. It discusses in greater depth many of the things that we discussed in today's lecture, and that in a sense provides a new way of looking at crises within capitalism in general. And when you read it, then maybe new questions will arise in your mind, and I'd be more than happy to address those questions. I don't promise to fully answer them because many of these issues are open-ended. A lot of research needs to be done, and the existence of these crises, the three crises that I pointed to, are already beginning, at least in the top universities of the world, leading to a serious rethinking about economics as a subject. Um, Professor Neil at Cambridge has written a paper called Economics in Disgrace, where he says that economics in the way it's been taught traditionally in neoclassical economics has failed to. He's referring to the crisis of 2008. Has failed to address that crisis. It has been unable to predict it, unable to understand what it is in any depth, unable to let alone propose policies. So in that sense, economics has failed. Then at least the traditional kind of conventional neoclassical economics. And he's made a plea for rethinking economics and looking at the market system not as an exclusive framework of resource allocation, but essentially as a coordinating mechanism between consumers and producers. And therefore, market system cannot be the sole framework of the allocation of national resources. But other economists also have begun to seriously question neoclassical economics and the way it is being taught. Economics in general has been taught. One of the leading figures in that is Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who won a Nobel Prize. He's a professor at Columbia. Then Professor Ha Jun Chang, who is also he's a professor at the University of Cambridge in England. He's also done very good work in that direction. And recently, a book came out, which is a collection of papers by all these people. Professor Ocampo, who's a professor at Columbia again, Professor Francis Stewart at Oxford. These people, and I had the humble opportunity, the honor and privilege to contribute a paper also to this book. Alhamdulillah, somehow they tolerated, the producers of the book tolerated my views. And I wrote this paper called Capitalism, Consciousness and Development. So this book has come out. It's called Economic Theory and Economic Policy Amidst Globalized Discontent. So it's a way, all of us writing separately, we were not in contact with each other. Writing separately, contributed papers which are really trying to question standard economics and trying to push back the frontiers of knowledge as far as economics is concerned in our own very limited, humble sort of fashion. So you could perhaps also have a look at that book. The point I'm making is that now voices are being raised about the very paradigm within which economics has been pursued, both researched as well as taught. And this is a good time for all of you to have bring in your fresh minds and your fresh experience to acquire the tools of analysis. And I've tried to give you some of these tools to acquire the tools of analysis through which you can actually contribute to the very changing of the subject which you have uh, taken on, which you have adopted, which you have committed to studying the subject of economics. You need, I attempted to give you in a rudimentary way some of the tools that will help you to rethink economics, but you need to study much more. We've got a brilliant faculty. They're going to also teach you fantastic new tools of analysis. And when you're done with it, you might be in a position to actually do research through which you can contribute to the development of the subject itself. That's why I think you are very lucky in being at ITU and being studying economics at this particular moment in the history of development of economics. My very best wishes and much love, and you look after yourself. We will have the last class. If by now somebody's come up with a question, there's still time. Yeah, one more minute. If you ask a question, we'll go beyond the 1 hour. Questions. Okay, right. So, folks, inshallah, I'll see you.
Sir, there is a question in chat box. How that is, how much social responsibility do Pakistani people feel in our local market when doing trade? Can we relate this concept to social order? Concept of social order.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Okay, let me say. Now, at the moment, by and large, there is a complete absence of any sense of social responsibility in the way individual businessmen are conducting their businesses, whether that business is in the field of manufacturing or in the field of trade. Uh, uh, that sense of responsibility is by and large absent. Individuals are completely preoccupied with making money by hook or by crook. Even in the capitalist system, there are certain rules. You know, one of those rules is that you don't, for example, if you're, let's say, selling wheat or sugar, you don't form a cartel and you link up with other producers and say, okay, now what we'll do is we'll start hoarding sugar, and so in order to push up the price of sugar, or we will pay a very low price to the growers so that we can make maximum profit out of it. And so if there are a small number of manufacturers of sugar, and they all get together and they decide to pay a very low price to the grower, and because there are a very large number of growers who are competing, they end up by giving virtually very little, to the grower and getting a huge profit out of it themselves. And then to further enlarge that profit, they might all of them start hoarding the sugar and push up sugar to an astronomical price. This is in fact what happened. Now that is a clear sign. I mean, it is not only a violation of the rules that are already in place, so it's not only illegal, in my view, but it is also highly irresponsible socially, because it's showing no responsibility to those who are actually producing the sugar cane, the growers, and they're showing no responsibility to the large number of human beings who are going to have to buy sugar at a huge price, which they can't really afford. So this is a kind of the most ruthless aspects of capitalism that we find appearing in Pakistan. And you're quite right, it's because of a lack of social responsibility. But it's also as a result of a lack of social responsibility of the government. Not just this government, but all past governments have shown this tendency, where really speaking, public office uh, is by and large people come into office in the top echelons through an electoral process that is loaded in favor of the ruling elite. And by and large, it's members of the ruling elite who come into power. And they use their public office, which is meant to improve the welfare of the people. They use their public office for private gain. And so that kind of tendencies, that, that what you call that social responsibility is actually quite right, rooted in the very social order itself, in the very institutional structure of this limited, what we call the limited access social order, or the rent-based social order. You see, the kind of institutional structure you have in Pakistan is systematically designed to generate rents for a small coalition of elites. And this example that I just gave you is illustrative of that. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for posing it. My very best wishes.